and welcome to this episode of It's Not You, but Sometimes It Is, where I had the pleasure of talking with Miss Kayla Carey, COO extraordinaire. She really did the fast track, and we had such a fun episode talking about how we had to really stumble our way through a very fast learning in the School of Hard Knocks to figure out leadership kind of the hard way. I know you're really going to appreciate it's very authentic conversation about learning the lessons of leadership and people problems in the world of healthcare. Enjoy. Welcome to It's Not You, but Sometimes It Is. And I'm so excited to introduce Kayla Carey and have her on the podcast today. Kayla is the Chief Operating Officer of Ambulatory Anesthesia Care in Chicago, Illinois. Kayla, thank you so much for being with us today.
Thank you for having me, Meg. Nice to see you again.
Yeah. So, Kayla, can you give us a little bit of background about how you got to this COO role in the company today? What was your path?
Sure. I'll give you this short version. I joined Ambulatory Anesthesia Care, which provides what it sounds like. We provide anesthesia care and perioperative care in the ambulatory setting, which for non-healthcare nerds is like the office or a surgery center. And I joined the organization about a year ago. I actually came in as a consultant to their executive team as a start, and then it was a really good fit for me longer term. So I transitioned into this role in January. But my route here was like anyone's route, a little bit circuitous. I started my career in clinical research. I have a public health background, and I was working in clinical cancer care and was doing more of like the research side of healthcare to begin with. I ended up taking kind of a research job in a business, and then very quickly turned into like a business role. And so kind of shed the clinical side of most of my work and moved into the business side of healthcare. I happened to be in the right place at the right time, which I think is a lot of our career success ends up being that. And I joined an organization that ended up going public very shortly thereafter, which meant the organization now needed to be able to do things it never had to do before, right? We had to report quarterly earnings. We went through a bunch of acquisitions and we had to integrate those companies into our business. We had all this new capital to innovate. And so I got some really good opportunities to work very closely with their COO as his chief of staff, and take on a bunch of opportunities early in my career that I never would have done otherwise. And then I was there for about 10 years. I left and started a tech company in the childcare space after I had my first son, and founded and built and raised for that business. And then when I exited that business, I just went into sort of like tour of duty roles, helping organizations, particularly it was the middle of COVID, helping them figure out how to transition from a place of perhaps some crisis, and be able to survive that crisis and hopefully thrive in the future. And that really took me up till this consulting opportunity, which was kind of a similar idea as like we're in transition. We need a little bit of advice on how to go forward. And it was a great fit.
Awesome. Okay, so the thread that I see and when we talked earlier as well is that you tend to jump toward the hardest challenges, right? Like, oh, this is really interesting, and yes, I would like to do that, right?
Yeah.
So, and I've heard that a lot, especially on this podcast, right? There's this theme that people see something challenging and they're like, oh, I'm interested in that. I like hard problems. I like to tackle big things. So, can you give us an example of one of the most challenging things you've been through, maybe even on the operations or culture side? Something that really interesting. What did you do to overcome it?
Yeah, I mean, I always think like someone in a role like mine at COO, like if you don't like solving a problem, you're really not a good fit for the job. And so like I think I naturally gravitated to roles in which you were essentially the fixer, right? and people were calling you in because they knew they had seen you fix things before and seen you solve hard problems. Uh, they'd seen you solve hard problems before, and so they'd give you more new, bigger problems. And so um, that is essentially how I ended up in this role. And most of the roles I've had over the last, decade and a half, I would say, have been similar problem solving roles. I think like the biggest challenges I've been faced with all have a similar sentiment, which is that um, I've been tasked with a lot of big business problems where it's like you need to find product market fit and you can't, and you haven't been able to over a long period of time using a lot of funding. Um, or, you have a cash flow problem or something like that, like big business challenges. But I think those really pale in comparison to the challenges I've had where it's like maybe you have a business problem, but at the center of that business problem is actually a people problem.
Mhm.
And so I think that becomes a lot more challenging to manage. In my consulting work, I have joined a couple of different companies at a place where their leadership team was aware of what their business problems were, which I always think is like a precursor to doing any work with them. It's like, do you know what your problems are? Like, are you aware of what is going on at your organization? And if you're not aware, at least if you don't have a sense of what's going on, you're really not someone I should work with, right?
Mhm.
Because that's like a very clear sign of a people problem. It's
Okay.
like people don't even know what's going on. But I have found in a couple scenarios where it's like they do know the results of what's going on, and maybe they know why it's happening, but they're unwilling to treat the actual root cause. And the root cause is usually like you have a toxic personality in management who other people are working around, or you have a leader that no one feels safe around. But it's always like some kind of like human dynamics that make it harder. Because if I'm trying to come in and help you solve that problem, but you are unwilling to actually look at the problem for what it is,
Yeah.
like we can't really get anywhere unless you're leaving, right? And so I think that's where I've run into like the biggest challenges is where like you have to kind of coax someone into a self-realization or a realization about their organization that they're really uncomfortable getting to.
Yeah. Yeah. That ostrich effect, right? If I really don't want to look at it, so I'm going to stick my
Yeah.
head in the sand. And
Hmm.
no matter how much you tell me, I'm going to pretend that it's something else. Okay.
Yes, absolutely.
And the human problems sometimes we avoid because they seem the most daunting. I've got a kitty problem right now. She's about to knock over my
She
life.
doesn't look like a problem. She doesn't look like a problem.
So, and I think we get confused when it comes to people. We're like, I'm not sure how to solve that. I feel like I can solve a market problem or a financial problem or even a systems problem, but we get scared about the people problems. And so sometimes you have to come in and say, look, we're going to address this people problem and stop ignoring it. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, it's awkward.
Yeah. Yeah. So the emperor has no clothes. You've got this toxic person in the C-suite that's causing all these problems, right? So and that always, when you come in and you find it's actually people problem or a culture issue, right?
Mhm.
Can you give us an example of when you did find a cultural issue that was stopping the strategy or that was really a root cause of a bigger business issue? What did that look like? And how did you solve it?
Yeah, I have one distinct story, which I have actually seen a number of times, but it's essentially like it doesn't even need to be on the executive team, but in some level of management.
Mhm.
But I worked in an organization, and I've also heard a lot of stories about other people who come to me and say, "I had this story." I'm like, "Oh my God, it's the same thread over and over again," right? But I worked in an organization where there was a guy in a management position, pretty high up. He was in a VP role, and just no one. He was a really high performer, which is almost always true of people who are allowed to stay in organizations who demonstrate some kind of toxic behavior.
Okay.
It's like they're a really high performer. That's probably how they got a management position because they were promoted for doing really good work.
Mhm.
And then, um, and then suddenly it becomes clear that no one actually wants to work for them or with them.
Mhm.
And in this case, the guy oversaw all of our account management, and basically like people were just like unwilling to work with him, and so they would go around him, right? Or they wouldn't feed him information that was obviously necessary to have a good account management department, right? It was like the communication lines were broken. um and I do think that's often the case, is like you have this environment and there's somebody who everyone's avoiding.
Mhm.
And that naturally just like it cuts off the communication trail. And so it's like that guy wasn't getting the information he needed from his team or from his peers, honestly.
Mhm.
And then he was also kind of a bad communicator himself. So he wasn't really feeding information back to anyone else. And it just created like essentially like a block in the
Yeah.
organization. It's like nothing can go in one way or the other. It's a dam.
Yeah.
Um, and so I think like in that case, I was responsible for saying, here are the people in the organization that really don't fit your values.
Mhm.
And there was a lot of pushback about, but he's so good, right? Like like the clients love him, right? And it was like, that is great. But if you can't come to terms with the idea that other people won't work with him, like, he shouldn't be a manager. Um, how much coaching has already gotten. In this case, he had already been provided a variety of professional development opportunities for this very reason.
Mhm.
And so, then it was like, can we put him into this position where he doesn't have to feel bad about being demoted? So we'll just carve out this position for him, and in which he never manages anybody.
Right.
And I think like this, you and I have talked about this before, which is like, I think an organization is like any other set of relationships. You have to be able to put in order to get out. And like, I call that, essentially social capital. Like if I don't have any social capital with you, I can't come to the bank and take any money out, right? There's no money in the bank.
Mhm.
And so like, if I'm not putting money into the bank, there's nothing there for me to go get. And I think this guy is just a good example of like, he didn't put any money in the bank even when he moved into the sole contributor role. Like nobody wanted to work with him. He couldn't be successful in it. So I think it's just really important that like we're not just, I don't think it was a good idea just to move him into this role. People still avoided him. It was better than him managing them, but only partially, right?
Yeah. Every time I start working with a new company and leadership team and they say, we just have communication problems, I'll ask a couple follow-up questions and I say, you don't have communication problems. That's sending and receiving messages. You've got trust problems. You've got relationship problems, and your trust banks are running low, right? You've
Yes.
taken a lot of withdrawals from the capital, from the trust bank. You're not making any deposits, right? And you've got all these broken relationships. That's your
Yeah.
problem, right?
Yeah, people call it different things. They'll say, we have a communication problem, we have an alignment problem, we have, they call it different things, but it's like centrally, some of your people will not work with some of your other people, and there is a reason for that, right? And that's why communication is broken. When you have a good relationship with someone, it's very easy to communicate effectively with them, right?
Yeah.
And it's only when you fear what will happen when you say something that you withhold information that could be useful to them.
Yeah. And speaking of this person who is toxic or dysfunctional, right? You and I talked about how we've had our share of mistakes that we made as we had to learn how to lead very quickly without a lot of skill building or mentorship. And sometimes we learn how to lead by watching the behaviors of people who don't do it well. So, can you give us an example of what you've learned from a bad boss you've had?
Yes, so many. I think I've had a number of observations from bad bosses, and they kind of run the gamut. I do think, a bad boss is just like a bad boyfriend or girlfriend. It's like you learn kind of what you don't want, and then you can take that information and implement it in your own life for the next date or whatever that you have. I had a series of bad bosses who did, I think, functional things or functional or tactical things that I didn't love, right? Like, hovering over your work or like the typical micromanager, just not giving you autonomy. And that to me was like very suffocating. But those were like good humans
Mm-hmm.
who were bad managers,
Mm-hmm.
right? And I think like that stuff is fixable. I think like someone who is a good human who has like great intentions and is just not good at managing, like that person should be coached.
Mm-hmm.
I've had a couple of bad bosses who I thought maybe were bad humans. And I do think that is harder to coach, like, because I think their intention was to withhold information. I think their intention, it's like, when I think of bad bosses, I think about people who fail to be transparent, right? They're gatekeeping information that other people would do better with having, or they're taking credit for things when they didn't do the work,
Mm-hmm.
or they're not elevating or sponsoring the people on their team to level up in the way that those people are able to do. And I think they're doing those things, at least from my observation, because they believe they win in some way
Right.
by doing
Yeah.
those things. And so like that's where I feel like that's just bad humaning. Like the best thing I believe I can do for my people is let them be as good as they are. And that looks good for me anyway,
Mm-hmm.
right? If I did nothing and my team was really successful, like that's my win. I get to take the win regardless of whether I really helped. And so like if the way I'm helping is making sure they are doing their best, I think that's where I spend a lot of my time now is like how do I support them doing their best?
Yeah. Like, is this a skills thing or a character thing? And that's
Correct.
a lot of what I think about for myself, right? Is like, if you're a character in a book, what kind of character do you want to be? What kind of leader do you want to be in this moment? And when we get insecure and we're all up in our egos, we're not a good character.
Mm-hmm.
So
Yeah.
that's not a lack of skill. That's us making bad choices because we're being selfish.
Well, and like in order to fix it, you need like an epiphany, right? You need like a total perspective change.
Yeah.
So I think like that's the stuff that feels like, if you have a boss who is acting like that, I do think to some extent you should not expect it to be fixed, right? Because they're going to need to like one day be hit right in the face with the idea that like, oh, I could just let go of the vine a little and all these people would enjoy their work so much more and they would be more successful. And I don't need to hold it so close to my chest, right?
Right.
Um,
Yeah.
but I mean, it can be fixed, but it's not the same as being like, stop asking your employees to copy you on every email, right? Like that's the thing you can just like immediately implement is like nobody likes that. And if you have an employee who needs to CC you on everything in order for you to believe they're doing their work, like that's the wrong employee. But if mostly it's about you. So stop doing that.
Yeah. Yeah. It's skill versus will,
Yes.
right? If I actually have the will to figure out how to be a good boss, I'll do it. I can gain the skill. Yeah.
Yeah.
So, you know the saying, sometimes we're our own worst enemies, right? So, can you share a time where you realized that you were really battling yourself, an old mindset or a trait? What did you learn and what did you carry forward from that experience?
Yes. And actually, this is a good example of a good boss. I in that role where joined that company that went public very shortly after I joined, I was in a role where I was getting all this visibility from people who, from the executive team or the ops leadership team. And I was very young, I was probably 25 when I joined that organization. So I had not had this exposure to these kinds of people in these kinds of jobs before. And then all of a sudden, all of my meetings were with them. Um, and I am naturally a pretty reserved person. I do a lot more listening than I do talking in my normal life. Um, and I'm pretty quiet. I think at the time in my career, I demonstrated some extroversion because I was very ambitious.
Mhm.
So like if there was a work problem or a work question, I was very happy to say like, "Oh, I'll take care. I'll look at that." Right? Can I look at that? Do you need any help with that? Right? but it was more so like I would do it. I felt comfortable doing it because I was in service of the work. And I was otherwise very uncomfortable, like providing my opinion when I wasn't specifically asked. And I had that problem my entire childhood, brought it into the workplace. And I specifically was invited to this executive leadership team meeting when I was working for the COO. And he said, I want you here observing what's going on. And I want that to be context for how you and I work together, right? Like how you're helping me. So I'm like, that's amazing. So excited, also terrified. And I went to the meeting and like he didn't introduce me to anyone. Like at the time I did not know anybody on this team. Hadn't worked with them at all. I walked into the room. I knew nobody. I was at least 15 years younger than the next youngest person in the room. They were all men. And I was like, I don't even know where to sit. Like I was like, I don't know where to sit. Like, should I sit with the EA in the back? Should I sit at the table? Like, I didn't have any information. He didn't introduce me to the team. He didn't tell them why I was there. So I was just getting like a lot of looks about like, who is this girl who just showed up to these meetings? And I didn't say anything. I didn't say hello to anybody. I didn't introduce myself. Spoke not at all during the first meeting. And I went back to my manager, who was not even in that meeting. And I went back to my manager, who has been one of my best bosses in my career. And I was like, I didn't say anything. I was like, I don't think I should go. Like, I was like, I didn't know what they were talking about. I didn't, like just terrified. And she said something that was very important to me. And I've integrated it quite a few times in my life because this is still kind of like my natural fallback is like, I'll offer my opinion if you ask it is like my fallback feeling. And so if I'm uncomfortable, I'm like just incredibly quiet. So I went back to her and I said, I sat through this meeting and I didn't say anything to anybody, and I didn't add anything to the meeting. And I'm not sure I should keep going. This was a mistake. And she said to me, she was like, he asked you to be in the meeting. It is your job to contribute. She was like, if you just like, no one ever invites you to a meeting thinking you will not add any value. And so if you are invited to the meeting, you have to find a way to add value. You can't just take, you have to be able to give.
Yeah.
And so she actually said, like, next, you're going to keep going because this is a huge opportunity for you. And the next time you have to say one thing.
Okay.
And I was like, okay. And like the next time I was like waiting for my opportunity, I was like, I have to find the right thing to say, like, what is the thing I'm going to feel strongly about? And it just so happened, like, it's like, obviously I have opinions. It's not like my brain was empty during the meeting. But so I was like, okay, well, this might be the best thing I have to say. So I'm going to say it.
Yeah.
And then, like you get reinforcement, right? You get sometimes not always positive reinforcement, but like you get reinforcement, like people don't just ignore what you said. And I kept doing that. Like I literally had to give myself a goal every time I went into the meeting, and I went from 1 to 2 to 3. And then it was like 3's enough. If I don't have if I don't have anything interesting to say after the third thing, like I think it's also a balance, right? You don't want to be the person who sucks all the air out of the room either. But it was super helpful advice from one of my best bosses that I've integrated. But I still sometimes go to meetings and say, you have to say one thing. Like in my brain, I'm going, you have to say one thing.
That's actually great advice for people who are a little more introverted. I have never had that problem, Kayla, but
yeah, you're like, I can't relate. But
and especially when we're thrust into leadership roles and we're newer at it, we have imposter syndrome. That's very common, right? And so it's you're actually getting paid to be there. You're expected to contribute. Go ahead and just push yourself to say something. One thing. I love that. Yeah.
Yeah. I think the other thing I learned from that was it was so uncomfortable to be there without him having sponsored me there, right? So like this idea of like sponsorship. And so like he didn't say, this is Kayla and here's why I invited her. And so so it was like very unclear to other people why I was there. It was also kind of unclear to me. And so like I've always taken that and into my when I'm managing people or if I invite someone to a meeting, I always if it's via email, like I'm sending someone in my place, or if I'm in the meeting and I'm saying, oh, I brought Jennifer, I always make it a point to say, I invited Jennifer to this meeting because Jennifer is the expert on this thing.
Hmm.
Or I invited Jennifer to this meeting because I'd like her to have exposure to this conversation.
Yeah.
And so like I always take that into a meeting because I think it's possible other people will feel similarly.
Right.
Plus, I'm trying to vouch for them. I invited them to this meeting,
Yeah.
right? So I'm going to vouch for why, I'm standing behind the idea that they're going to add value to this meeting.
Yeah. Nice. And that context gives everyone a little bit more orientation to how to interact with that
Yeah.
person.
And
Yeah.
there was one example where I did that for someone, and then I said, she's our internal expert on patient experience or something. And and then someone during the meeting they said, okay, well, I'd like to hear from our patient experience expert, right?
Yeah.
And so then it gave her like someone else said that. So it like gave her an opportunity to show her expertise. And I know particularly before the meeting, she was like, I'm going to puke. I don't want to go to this meeting. So, so I think it helped her get rid of some of that imposter syndrome. Like someone's turning to you asking for your expertise. So you must have expertise.
Yeah. Yeah. Great. So let's fast forward a bunch of years because now, Kayla, you are a leader of leaders who are leading other leaders, right? As a
Sure.
COO of a company with 300 plus employees. So, my last question for you in this role now, you've got visibility 5 years out in the future. So, what do you think your leadership team is going to need to be optimized for where the company's going 5 years out? You guys have grown a lot, right?
Mhm.
So, in looking at the leaders that you're leading, what differences do you think you want to see in this leadership team to really be optimized for 5 years out from now?
When I joined the organization last year, we did part of it was that the organization was very entrepreneurial and had grown from nothing and is now a much bigger organization in several states.
Mhm.
Um, and so, they had like this very grassroots entrepreneurial mindset, and that's how they had built the business. Like most of the people who built the business are still in the business. And so I think now at the size they're at, you have to take some of the entrepreneurial mindset and couple it with like standards and expectations and like a rubric for stuff. And so I think like that's like the pivot point they were at was like, yes, we can keep flying by the seat of our pants. Um, and that's been pretty successful, right? But like if we can include some rigor or discipline about like how do we do things at scale,
Yeah,
we will surely benefit from that.
right.
So there were, it was a really flat organization. And so we were able to take some people who had been demonstrating their ability over many, many years with the organization and give them more leadership responsibility and departmental leadership responsibility. Because previously, most of the departments were managed directly by the executive team, and then it was kind of flat underneath
Okay.
them.
Yeah.
So like providing some leverage to the executive team and then also leveraging some of this talent that they had and giving them management responsibilities and then giving them leverage by having people underneath them who had specific responsibilities.
Right.
And so I would say like that part is still pretty new because it really just happened at the beginning of this year and last fall. So now it's really like those people had all the skills and functional expertise to take those roles. But they didn't previously have the responsibility or the authority in many cases. And so now it's just, I think, coaching um, on the kind of soft skills, emotional
Mhm.
intelligence, like of which, I really think this team has quite a bit of.
Mhm.
But just some of those skills that like you only really get to test out once you're actually doing the job.
Mhm.
I have a book coming out this summer about kind of like the mid-careerist guide to leveling up. And I think it's a lot of stuff that I've repeated over and over in my career when people have asked me for advice. But I think it's probably like advice. Some of it is applicable to this team is like, how much information do you share with other people? Like, how much information do you hold back? Like, what's the level of transparency that other people need?
Right.
And then like, how do you support the people on your team to feel really good about the work they're doing?
Mhm.
Um, and so I think there's like how do you communicate and all that stuff that we were already talking about. I think like there's a lot of like shift at a certain point in your career where it goes from being you have to have a lot of functional expertise. Like at the beginning of your career, people are looking at you like, are you good at spreadsheets? Are you, are you excellent at reviewing this information? Or like, are you really good at collections or something like that? Like they want like really functional expertise. When you move into management, especially as you move up in management, like functional expertise becomes very insignificant, really, to how you do the job. And most of the job is, people management, right? Like most of it is managing the dynamics of the people on your team and making sure people have what they need to be successful. And so it's not, you're coaching a lot more on
Mhm.
soft skills than on functional expertise. So I think that's like where the organization has the biggest opportunity for growth is like we've leveled these people up and given them all this responsibility. I think they're ready to take it on, but like let's also make sure that they know exactly what they need to do to
Mhm.
keep moving the organization forward with
Absolutely.
support, of course.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And I'm excited for you guys. It sounds
Yep.
like you've gotten a lot of traction. Really exciting company to be a part of right now. So,
Yep.
congratulations. And Kayla, thank you so much for your authenticity and sharing all this with us. It's been a lot of fun.
Thanks, Meg. Thanks for having me.